Back when I was growing up, they still had the DARE program. So I remember going through DARE. I remember them bringing in the suitcases of the different substances, and I remember having a tremendous amount of fear and even having that perception of what a quote-unquote drug addict looked like, you know. But the beauty of it is we get to meet people where they're at genuinely and walk alongside them as they journey this oftentimes challenging, scary road to recovery. She was just this powerhouse of a woman. And when I say powerhouse, she loved so fiercely. And she, to this day, when I think about times where I felt the most loved in my life tangibly, it was by her. And so that's something that I think of often because I want people to leave my presence feeling cared for and important and loved, just like she did for me.
Welcome, self-actualizing listeners. I'm your host, Justin the Addiction Guy, and today I sit down with Tiffany Neuharth, who has started Rise Up Recovery, an incredible organization in Hastings, Minnesota that helps people who fall through the cracks in the community who are struggling in the isolation of addiction, the isolation that addiction thrives in. And these people have a wonderful community center now in Hastings at Rise Up, and sober homes, and team of recovery specialists who are helping them to rebuild their lives one day at a time. Could you imagine spending a year of your life in rehab? That's part of Tiffany's amazing story, and I can't wait for you to hear the rest of it. She went to a place called Minnesota Adult and Teen Challenge, which helps people with finding Jesus Christ in order to stay sober, and I wanted to explore that in this Christmas episode.
I remember being a little girl and having this sort of, you know, some AA and NA, some 12-step programs call it that restless, irritable discontent. And I remember feeling that way from the time I was a little kid, so much so that I would do the spinning around as much as I could until I would just get dizzy and almost throw up to make myself feel different than I felt. But I do remember in terms of specifically drugs and alcohol, I remember sitting in kindergarten class when you do the I pledge to be drug-free until whatever year your graduation was. Mine was 2002. I'm going to date myself. So drug-free until 2002. And I remember wholeheartedly believing that. Like, yes, I am going to be drug-free. Drugs are scary. Drugs are bad. Kind of having that preconceived notion that you just don't do drugs. You just don't, you know. But on the flip side of that, I have pictures of me as a little girl in a diaper. I mean, literally a diaper and those fireman boots with a beer bottle in my hands. You know, because I think my dad drank beer and I wanted to be like my dad. And so we'd empty it out and fill it with water, and I could drink the water out of there, but I would also sneak the very bottoms of his beer when I was a little kid. So I think there was always this draw in me to substances, but yet also that sort of fear of maybe some of the bigger, quote-unquote, scarier drugs. If that makes sense.
It sounds like alcohol was funny and didn't really count.
Yeah, and normalized. I grew up in northern Minnesota. That was sort of the culture there. People drank. There was just as many bars as churches, if not even more. And so, yeah, alcohol was such a normal thing, a normal part of my family's landscape that I don't think it even registered to me that that was something that could be dangerous. Back when I was growing up, they still had the DARE program. So I remember going through DARE. I remember them bringing in the suitcases of the different substances, and I remember having a tremendous amount of fear and even having that perception of what a quote-unquote drug addict looked like, you know, somebody that's homeless or gonna rob you or hurt you or that kind of thing. And so, yeah, there was definitely fears around drugs. That mentality, well, that happens to maybe those people, but that's never going to happen to me. So there was this disconnect, you know, and a lot of stigma around drug addiction and drug addicts and different hard drugs, if you will. And so I absolutely had no intention of ever going down that road. It was something that was not even on my radar.
Tell me about the first memory of using or something like that.
Yeah, I had an older sister, 4 years older than me. We were really close. And every summer we would go up to our family's cabin. And there was all the cousins there. And I was the youngest. And they sort of threw me in with the older cousins, I think in part for them to look after me. And so the other family could be down by the fire drinking and that sort of thing. And I remember that they had marijuana. That was my first introduction to using marijuana. And it was one of those things where all the cousins were doing it. I mean, there's probably 8 to 10 cousins. And here's little me. And they were not going to let me do it. But I did one of those, well, if you don't let me try it, I'm going to tell on you. And so that was my first experience with drugs. It just so happened that marijuana was laced with PCP at that time. So my first encounter with using drugs was not what was expected at all. It scared my cousins a lot. It scared me to a certain degree, but there was also this strange kind of, oh, well, I fit in with the big kids now. Like kind of this sense of belonging. Like I've kind of gone through this initiation process, if you will, and there was secrecy around it. So there was, just a sense of, well, now I'm in the club kind of thing. So while it was equally scary, there was also this kind of perception of, well, it's kind of cool too.
Okay. I was going to ask why you demanded to use it or tell on them. I wonder where that motivation came from. It sounds like I want to belong.
Yes, the crowd mentality. I want to be a part of and do what you guys are doing. And, I think part of the danger in that for me was, while it was a scary experience, I came out pretty unscathed. And it gave me this puffed up sense of kind of invisibility, if you will, and definitely decreased my inhibitions for trying even harder substances further down the road.
Oh, so what did that do to your prejudices about drugs that the DARE program tried to teach you?
It definitely altered that. It gave me this sense of, well, they're not as bad as what they said. I think I had this misconceived notion of, well, if I do these drugs, I'm going to immediately turn into an awful person. And, this kind of the images that are portrayed of what a quote unquote drug addict is. It wasn't clear to me that it's a process of turning into that, well, see, I used this marijuana and it was laced with this other drug and I'm fine. Today, I'm fine. And so, again, it created that kind of disconnect of the dangers that were really involved with continuing down that road. So it softened it, right? It softened it. It made it not as bad, and honestly probably created some mistrust with the authorities that told me those things because, well, clearly they're wrong, right? Clearly they're wrong. When in reality, they weren't wrong. It was just maybe how I perceived the information that they shared.
Where did that lead you? Where did the next kind of drug take you, and how did you find it?
So I would say it left me curious. And now keep in mind, I was probably in 6th grade. Yeah, I was still in grade school, 6th or 7th grade. I was maybe middle school, first year in middle school. And I would say that it started to pave the way for me changing my friend group. I started hanging out with some of the kids who experimented more because I still had that curiosity. And that led to more experimentation, smoking more marijuana, drinking more frequently. It wasn't a pattern of regular use at this point in time, but it was definitely experimentation. And that lasted, I would say, all the way through middle school into high school. That kind of experimentation and willing to experiment and even seeking opportunities to experiment with greater substances, heavier alcohol, that sort of thing. It was my 11th grade year in high school. I was introduced to cocaine for the first time. And that was the first time that I really, where everything that they taught me in DARE and in school, where you can become addicted right away, that's what my story was when I tried stimulants. It was an immediate, after the first use, I was hooked. which was different than some of the other substances.
Did it make you feel like you belonged in this new special friend group, this exclusive group or something?
It did. I very much lived this double life because I was a honor student. I was in advanced placement classes, so I was, one of the kind of smart kids. I was also in sports. I was in cheerleading. But there was this whole other side of my life that not everybody knew about. And the part of me liked that. Part of me liked having that whole other piece of myself that was hidden, that I could appear one way, but the reality was I was able to indulge in some of these things that really ultimately were harmful, but at the time I perceived them as fun, exciting, exhilarating,
How did stimulant use affect your high school, the rest of your high school?
From the first time I tried cocaine, it was less than 3 months before I was failing school, completely alienated from my friend group, very isolated from my family, I would say extremely depressed, and ultimately suicidal. So from the time I first experimented, which was at the end of my 11th grade year, I didn't even start my senior year where I grew up in Hibbing because it destroyed everything.
Sorry that happened to you.
Mm-hmm.
Why do you think why do you think it affected you kind of more intensely than maybe some other friends that you were doing it with?
Yeah, it definitely did, Justin. It was a night and day difference. I remember the person who introduced me to it, she felt terrible that she introduced me to it because she was someone who could, recreationally use, if you will, and I was not at all. And so a major difference between myself and the other kids that I was using with. And this was a really small group of kids. It wasn't like there was a lot of us, right? I think my brain is wired differently. I wholeheartedly believe that I am predisposed. There's a long line and history of substance use disorders in my family, from my mother to my grandfather to, multiple generations of alcoholism and drug addiction. And so I think there was that genetic component to it. And I think there was also some emotional and mental health stuff going on that for the temporary, it seemed to kind of balance my brain chemicals out. I think I was really struggling with some depression and didn't realize that that's what was going on. And so there was this temporary elevation of mood and feeling good that I didn't get naturally. And so it was this then constant pursuit of that feeling of pleasure, of euphoria, and then ultimately even just trying to feel normal.
So what happened next in your life?
Yeah, so I grew up without my biological mother. She left when I was 15 months old. That was directly related to her substance use and mental health concerns. And so she lived in Minneapolis. I grew up in Hibbing, Minnesota. Didn't have much contact with her, but we decided that I was going to try the relocation solution. For anybody who hasn't heard of that, let's just change where I'm physically located, move away from my perceived problems in hopes that will be a solution. And that was not effective whatsoever. So I moved down to Hopkins, and I went from a school of less than 300 students in my class to over 800 students in my class. There was a ton of culture shock. It was very overwhelming. And within 2 weeks of starting that new school in my senior year, I was completely connected with the kids who were really wrapped up with substances, way worse than where I left in Hibbing. So that led to much more substance use, higher risk behaviors. It led to ultimately me being very depressed and suicidal and recognizing I can't stop on my own. So that was the first time I went to treatment. I went to treatment when I was 18 years old. It was the middle of my senior year in high school, and I went to a residential treatment program. I put myself in that program.
Why do you think there's so many drugs in school?
Oh, I don't know. That's a really good question. I think there's a lot of kids that were like me that had big holes in their hearts, that had pain that they were trying to cover up, and their main means of coping was the use of mood-altering substances. And I think, I remember as I first started cocaine, I remember having this thought. You originally asked, well, did you have fears of intoxicants, and kind of what was your mindset around substance use? And I brought up the whole DARE program, and I remember, I could, as clear as you and I are talking today, I can remember having the thought when I was high on cocaine, man, they were really wrong about this. This drug is great. If only everybody knew how good this made them feel. Not only would it not be legal, but everybody would use it, right? That's a sort of mind space, and you and I know it now as insanity.
Everyone should try it.
Right.
As soon as you discover something that makes you feel good, the whole world needs to try this.
How are they withholding this from us? It's amazing.
I
right?
was in my second AA meeting ever, and I was still kind of detoxing and sweating out the alcohol. And in this AA meeting, where there's a lot of traditional shares and like kind of conservative religious culture, I said, guys, you got to try Valium. I knew I would never quit drinking until I had my first Valium. And then everything felt like it was possible.
Exactly. Yes.
And it took me a couple of years to finally wean off and detox off my benzo addiction after that.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Isn't that interesting? Yes. Great. So we completely get it, on the same page with that insanity. I couldn't imagine a life without the use of substances. I couldn't, at that young age. And then even when I really got wrapped up in it deep later on, it was, I had this, and again, that was some of the mental health stuff, some of the depression stuff, some of that spiritual hole that I really had, where something was missing, and I felt like that was the puzzle piece that had been missing all along, until it absolutely destroyed my life. And then it was this sort of ominous sense of, okay, well, clearly I can't do that, but now what? How do I live on life's terms? I don't know.
Yeah, I was going to say, it's like there was not a need for it before, and then it creates this daily need to have it, which creates a fear of not having it every day. And then it's sort of this manufactured fear that comes into our lives. And I wonder, so before, you think that there was sort of this need to fill some sort of void in you. There always was.
Yes. That goes back to that feeling restless, irritable, and discontent that I remember feeling from the time I was a little kid. I think some of that was brain chemical stuff for me. I think some of that was trauma related from my mom leaving when I was so little, and just that kind of toxic environment where there was a lot of conflict going on growing up. When you're little like that, you don't have the means to cope. You just don't.
It sounds like you've done a lot of post-traumatic growth in your recovery.
Absolutely. Yes.
It just seems to be that way, the way that you carry yourself.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you.
And how did you come up with the idea for Rise Up Recovery then?
Oh my goodness. Well,
was this way ahead on the timeline, or?
This is definitely way ahead of all that. There's so many years in between there, but I would say one of the things that was really amazing about that first treatment that I went to was, first of all, I learned so much about myself. I learned a lot about my brain. I learned a lot about the disease, the disease model of addiction, and that it wasn't this, okay, I'm a bad moral person that I need to just shape up. That sense of helplessness and hopelessness and being stuck there's a brain reason for that, right? The neurological brain chemicals in my body and all of that kind of stuff. It made sense to me of, oh, okay. So that was huge to have some answers about why I was the way that I was, and to recognize that this is a treatable illness really produced a lot of hope in me. And that made me want to become a counselor myself. So that's when I decided in that first treatment that I wanted to go to college to become a drug and alcohol counselor myself. I wanted to help people like I was helped through this treatment that I went through. And I did that.
Can I ask where you went?
Yeah, I went to MCTC,
Where's that?
Minneapolis Community and Technical College.
Oh, I meant for treatment.
Oh, for treatment. Yes. Yeah. I went through Fairview Hospital. This was when they had, I think they still do, I don't know for sure, but they had the STOP program, adolescent, which is kind of an hospital extended assessment program. So I was in there for 2 weeks, I think. And then I transferred from there to an outpatient program that they had, and this was in Crystal for adolescents. And I lived in a house. I know they don't have this anymore. It was called the Nord House, which was a home for girls, adolescent girls, going through the outpatient program, kind of like a Lodging Plus sort of program for adolescents.
What a great resource.
Yeah, it was great. It was great. Yeah, and it was neat to meet other kids who were around my age, who were going through the same thing, and it was very different from the friends that I used with who maybe didn't have a recognition of their problem, and some maybe were able to recreationally use, although I would argue that you can't when you're that age, really healthy. And here I'm amongst peers who also really were in trouble, who were really struggling and kind of caught up, in this substance use disorder. And so it helped to normalize it for me too, and helped to give me hope that, okay, I'm not unique. That sort of terminal uniqueness was challenged, and there's hope, and we can get better together. So
yeah, that's one of those things about this life change and this healthy change, is that it's such a social group kind of addiction, and who you hang with is really connected to your unhealthy chemical use. So you have to kind of extract yourself sometimes from an entire social community, and then the whole added, anxiety of making new friends. Like, how did you cope with that?
Well, yeah, I mean, it is such an important developmental time. That is, your whole world is your friends at that age. It's social life is everything. I would say, fortunately, I wasn't really deeply connected, because remember, I had moved from Hibbing to Hopkins, and so I had just gotten kind of plugged in with kind of that using crowd. And so even the relationships that I had were pretty superficial. They were based around substance use and partying. There wasn't any really deep-rooted heart-to-heart connections there. So it was a matter of, okay, now I just need to get re-engaged, but in a healthier community. And so for me, that was being intentional about going to meetings that young people were at. And fortunately, the treatment program that I was in, they introduced us to some of those meetings. So I was able to start that process of building some of those relationships and some of those connections. And then shortly after that, I started college. And the college that I went to at MCTC, there's a really strong recovery community at that college. So I was able to get plugged in. So it was really a transfer of connecting with the recovery community.
Okay. Did you feel any shame from your community, any community that maybe you grew up in, or in general, of kind of becoming one of those kids that got addicted to drugs? Or
Definitely. And it was all perceived on my end. There was nothing that anybody did to make me feel that way. When I moved away from my hometown, I completely disengaged, and I think the reason for that was shame. So I didn't stay connected with any of my past high school friends. I would talk to my family that I moved away from, I would say that was all rooted in shame, because I felt so ashamed that I had become addicted, and that I went from being a cheerleader and all these things to somebody that I never imagined that I would become. So it took many years for me able to go back and face that community again. And there's been a lot of healing since that time. But when I say a number of years, I'm saying I left when I was 18 years old, and I went back to it was my 20-year high school reunion was the first time that I actually re-engaged with some of those folks that I graduated from high school from. Yeah.
I can relate to the shame kind of self-shunning me, and we have a part, like we play a part in everything, and we're not necessarily entirely victims of the world of shame culture. Mm-hmm. Although that does exist, there is sort of a self-shunning part of it that I play. Mm-hmm. And actually, I've had these awakenings where I'm thinking, I think people that I think you know, wish me no wish failure or jealousy or all that negative energy that I might be sensing. I think actually maybe that's all in my head, and these people actually want me to succeed and just be happy. Like people would love it if I would just be happy and actually accomplish something with my life.
Yeah, absolutely. That was my experience going back. And when I went back, Rise Up Recovery was a thing that was started, and I've come so far in terms of I feel zero shame today around my substance use, around mental health, zero shame.
Why?
I would say because there's so much power in my testimony, and there's so much power in being able to be sort of a walking display of hope, which I perceive myself as somebody who was once deemed hopeless, even by professionals. I mean, I had professionals, Justin, as somebody who's a professional, this kind of blows our mind, but I have had professionals tell me, I think you're one of those people that is just hopeless. I think you're one of those people who's just not going to make it, because that's the place that I was in. I went to college, became a drug and alcohol counselor. I did that for 8 years. Had a really robust career. I started working with adolescents, loved that. I really enjoyed my job. And for me, it was a bit of a slow fade. So drugs were clearly off limits. But alcohol was one of those things that I continued to dabble with and to use. And
what kind of recovery culture were you in? Or were you still involved in recovery culture?
Not really.
Okay.
Yep.
You were professional now, so.
Yep. Exactly. So that was my perceived recovery. Well, how I work on my recovery is I work.
Okay.
I work and I help other people.
And it's exhausting to kind of go to a meeting sometimes after a day with our patients.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. And being in a community, you don't want to, you got to have some boundaries too, and not be going to meetings and that sort of thing in the same community that you work in. And so, yeah, I had all kinds of excuses. That was the reality of it, all kinds of excuses. And so, yeah, I continued to drink alcohol. I perceived it to be irresponsibly because I wasn't getting DUIs. I didn't have all these consequences from it, but the reality was my drinking was not normal drinking either. I know that now. And what that did for me was, again, as I talked about earlier, with kind of the marijuana use and desensitizing me from potential consequences of trying heavier substances, the same thing happened with alcohol. I had given myself permission to drink, which then gave myself permission to, when I fell down some stairs and herniated a disc in my back, to take prescription opiates, and then to start misusing prescription opiates, which then ultimately led to also adding stimulants back into the picture. And you can see how this spiral goes downhill. And then you introduce shame. That happened really early on, actually. And I should have known better, quote unquote, right? I was a professional. I had all the head knowledge in the world. And yet here I was back to living that sort of double life. And it absolutely crushed me. So from the time I started prescription opiates till the time that I was, basically homeless, alienated from my family, was just a handful of months. Again.
Wow, it happened really quickly again.
Yes. Yeah, I was not one of those people who sometimes is termed a functional user. There was no functionality to my substance use. There wasn't. I wasn't able to hold down a job. I wasn't able to function in society. My mental health, they were so intricately connected, my mental health and substance use, that as soon as I started using substances, I was extremely depressed, very anxious. And then with the use of stimulants, there was a whole plethora of some complex mental health issues, psychotic symptoms and episodes, hallucinations, all those kinds of things. So, yeah, there was no functionality to it. And that was a period of, I think, 5 or 6 years of absolute destruction and chaos.
What happened next?
Well, I went through, I would say, easily a dozen residential treatment programs. probably another 8 plus outpatient treatment programs.
Were you impressed with the counselors?
I was probably a really challenging client.
Because you were a professional.
Right. You're not going to tell me anything I don't know.
I'll write my own treatment plan.
Exactly, right? Oh my goodness. Yeah, it was probably really challenging. But deep within, there's always this piece of me that really wanted to get well. I wanted to get well, but again, I was so stuck. And it was, yeah, it became, I knew I was active in my disease, and I knew I didn't want to live like this forever, but I also didn't know how to get myself out of it, So yeah, there was multiple treatment episodes. There was multiple hospital stays for psychiatric conditions. I mean, I would say another 7, 8 plus inpatient hospital stays. Ultimately, I had a near completed suicide where I flatlined 3 times, was non-responsive, multiple opiate overdoses where I was revived from Narcan. I found myself in a treatment center down in Mankato, continuing to use in this treatment center. I was involved with a really rough crowd too, really not good people at all. And the stereotypical people that they talked about in DARE, that was my crowd at that point in time, because that's where I was getting my substances from. A long line of traumatic event after traumatic event, just really kind of dug myself this hole of this pain and misery, which then gave me a lot of excuses to continue the behavior that I was engaged in. But in this treatment, I had this moment, and this was kind of the beginning of this spiritual awakening that I had. I had this moment where I was planning my suicide again because I almost completed the previous one, but I didn't. And that was, in my mind's eye, that point in time, that was my only way out. There was no treatment that was going to help me. There was nobody that could help me get out of this. Clearly, all the head knowledge I had wasn't going to help me. So, my only option is to end my life. And for a split moment, I saw what would happen to my niece. I didn't have any kids of my own at that time, but I had a really close connection with my little niece. What would happen to her if I chose to continue down that path? And I saw her life and her heart shattered because of the decision that I was about to make. Just like my life and heart had been shattered by my mom and her addiction and, this sort of generational kind of pattern. And that was the first time, this sounds crazy, but it's true. That was the first time in all these years of chaos that I was able to see past my own stuff, past my own pain, past my own shame, and able to actually see how I was impacting other people around me. I had family telling me, this hurts, we have to distance ourselves. And I was like, okay, it just kind of brushed off. But in that moment, I saw this other person's life and heart being so deeply impacted by the choices I was making that it was enough to snap me out of it. And so I reached out for help. I told my sister, this is my plan. I don't want to do this, but I feel like I have no other way out. I need you guys to just lock me up for a while. I need protection against myself. And they did that. They got me into a hospital, and this was December 18th, 2016. And I was in the emergency room. It was a long time before a bed was available, but ultimately I got to a hospital and their mental health unit. And Christmas Eve of that same year, so a handful of days later, Christmas Eve, there was a nurse who was just sitting on the edge of my bed and kind of doing some intake paperwork, and I was sharing my story with her, and really kind of marinating in my self-pity about how I'm stuck and can't get out of this hole and there's no point to living. And she looks at me really poignantly and she says, Tiffany, you need God. God is the only one that can get you out of this pit that you've dug for yourself. And I crossed my hands. That was the last thing on earth I wanted to hear at that moment. And I said, no, you don't understand. I just need somebody to save me and somebody to prove that I'm worth saving. I spoke those words out of my mouth. And as soon as I got those words out of my mouth, it was almost like a movie in my mind where I saw all of these times that I should have been dead, the overdose deaths, a car accident. By the way, I had a neck brace on because my neck was broken in 3 places from a car accident I was in, and a broken foot. all the traumatic experiences that I went through. I mean, I could list off dozens of times that I should have been dead, that there was no logical explanation for me being alive, except for the grace of God. And that shook me to my core. It absolutely shook me to my core. It was this complete, profound shift in my thinking. It was this complete, profound shift in my desires, that obsession, that compulsion that I had that from the time I was a little kid. I woke up the next day on Christmas Day and it was gone. I felt like a completely different person. When they talk about having that sort of spiritual awakening, I wasn't seeking after it. It just happened to me. And that changed everything. That's the crazy thing about the disease of addiction. It's a selfish disease. And we don't have the ability oftentimes to see beyond our own pain and our own suffering. And it's all because it's all consuming, right? But that was a moment where I was able to see, and it shook me to my core.
Well, as you know, I work in inpatient mental health with similar patients and similar places in their lives, and you're really just as an example giving me so much hope and kind of encouraging me never to give up on any of these people that I work with and never to feel hopeless for them to have potential. And so how did you get from that to what you're doing now?
Yeah, that's a good, fun question. I would say from that moment on, from Christmas Day on, my life took a completely different trajectory. It was on a completely different course. I knew from that moment on, and the best way I can put it is I just had this recognition that my life was no longer my own. It wasn't about me anymore. It was about I was given this gift, and I had this very clear awareness that my life had a purpose. I didn't know what the purpose was. I didn't have a clue. I just knew that clearly I had survived all of these things, and there was a reason that I was still there. And so it gave me new meaning. It gave me new drive. And again, I felt this sense of freedom. So I ended up going through a long-term treatment. It was a year-long treatment. And then I took a whole other year after that to go through ministry school. And so it was 2 years that I was completely removed from any of that stuff, even any temptations, even really. I was sort of in this bubble for 2 years. And
which was that treatment that worked?
It was Teen Challenge.
Okay.
Yep. Teen Challenge. Yeah. And it was a great treatment. I got to, my philosophy behind that was like, okay, well, I feel like I met God last night. I need to go where I can learn about him. I don't even know what that means or what that looks like. It's not like I had a religious upbringing, or I don't even consider myself a religious person today. I consider myself a very spiritual person. But what better place to go where I can be around people who claim to know him, and I can go learn about him too. And so that was basically my mission for a year, was to go and to heal. There was so much I needed healing from. And that was one of the beauties of it, was I was able to be removed from, I'm talking about, I didn't even watch the news. I didn't, the limited phone calls that I had were with my family. I really took a year to just heal. And it's exactly what I needed. So I did that, and then the ministry school for the year after that, which was just an opportunity for me to kind of continue learning and growing and healing in a way that I was back in the world, but there was still a soft landing place for me. I was still surrounded by community and familiar community. And then what happened after that was just doors opened up before me to get my license back, my counseling license. I never thought I was going to be a counselor again. That was not even on my radar. It wasn't something that I even wanted to do. But it was something that sort of fell in my lap, and I'm like, oh, I'll try it again. And I started doing assessments, and it was like, okay, I really love this. I forgot how much I love this. And it was a whole different experience for me, because before I kind of had this spiritual awakening, we talk about shame. I feel like so much of my life had this undergirding of shame just that followed me everywhere. Some of it was false, some of it was self-created, some of it stemmed back from the abandonment and rejection of my mom, where I always just felt like, well, I'm disposable, and so there's got to be something wrong with me or dysfunctional within me, broken. And I lived that pattern out until I had that spiritual awakening and that shift of like, no, wait a minute, I'm loved, I'm wanted, and there's a purpose for my life. That changed everything. Now all of a sudden, the person I once was, that was deemed hopeless and really was not a good person in a lot of ways, the huge change that I had in my heart, I was able to rejoice in that rather than be ashamed of who I once was. The big piece too is I have this deep, profound understanding of that I'm loved, and that for me, in my own right, like I can embrace my weakness. I can embrace the fact that I struggle, that on my own I can't accomplish much. I don't personally resonate with that sort of empowerment, like, you are amazing, you can do anything that you can possibly dream.
Manifest anything.
Right. That's not been my experience. My
you
experience,
are God. Like,
right,
you can.
Exactly.
Yeah.
My experience, no, I'm a hot mess when I'm left to my own devices. And so there's this power, this loving, right, for me, Christ being who is so much greater than I am, who loves me unconditionally, and I'm secured in his love despite my failures, because he's perfect and I'm not. So I don't have to be perfect because I can rely on his perfection, which isn't a green light to just go out and, make a mess of my life, but the love that I have from him propels me to better, right? And so, but yeah, recovery, there's so many different pathways, there's so many different beliefs and spiritualities, and we know from the literature that that people who have some foundation in spirituality, whatever that is, we know that their outcomes tend to be better. We just know that. We know that from research. And so what that is for people, what they resonate, how they get there, great. Yeah, I get to silence my inner critic because I don't, I can wake up in the morning with the recognition that I'm not perfect and no amount of striving for perfection is going to get me there. And so I can meet today where today's at, and I can show up and do my best. And that's okay. That's good enough. And some days might be, I'm pregnant. I'm really tired these days. Some days that may be like, hey, I got up and I showered and then I lounged around and relaxed the rest of the day. That's okay. I don't have to beat myself up over that. Where in the past that wouldn't be the case. It would be a completely different dialogue of like, you lazy bum. Yeah, that kind of inner critic tape that runs through my head, So yeah, it's a different way. It's a different kind of relationship. I think we have so many different relationships in our lives. We relate with other beings, with other friends. I have different relationships with my dogs. I also have a relationship with myself. I have a relationship with substances, or a lack thereof at this point in time, but nonetheless, I get to choose how I interact with these different people and different relationships. And, I get to choose today to interact with myself with kindness and with compassion and with grace and mercy, because I need it.
What you said about perfection and kind of being free of that shackle of that perfectionism stress of, if I'm not perfect, then my recovery isn't perfect, and then I don't have the connection with God, or how that happens with some people in 12-step recovery culture. Like, that's really interesting. That's interesting that you're able to live life with a loose cloak, like that true, how it was intended to live, and not to be straining for perfection, like some 12-step recovery culture kind of pressures people towards.
Sure.
How did you get there?
I would say a lot of work. It's been a lot of, and it continues to be, right? Again, I don't do that perfectly either. What's so helpful for me is viewing myself in proper perspective, not making more of myself than I really am, but also not making less of myself. I have the privilege of living in this kind of tension, and that's what I love so much about my faith and some of those Christian rooted principles. I get to live in this tension of both brokenness and perfection, but within that there's this security, right, of I still have brokenness. I will, through my whole life, this side of eternity, I just will. To think otherwise is unrealistic. Like, I fall short in my thoughts every single day. I may not go out and do something super damaging action-wise, but in my thinking, I fall short every day. I have judgments towards people, judgments towards myself. I know that I'm perfect. I mean, if you think of the measure of perfection, we can never, ever reach that. Nobody possibly can.
It's best to let it go.
Right, yeah. So why even try? But on the other hand, so I can recognize and accept my brokenness. And I can recognize that the love that I live in, this love from a God who is love himself and can't change that his love for me isn't dependent upon how I am. That for me gives me that permission to be human and to struggle. And rather than running from, which is what shame does, right? Let's turn away from and hide. It's this beautiful invitation to run towards. Well, let's run towards this forgiveness, this love, this grace, this compassion. And that includes relationships with other people. That includes having that and fostering that relationship with myself.
I love any philosophy towards being human. You use the word mercy, and I have had recent experiences of profound gratitude and acceptance for the particular journey that I'm on in life, where I've been known to wrestle and temper tantrum and sort of not in that lack of acceptance where we find ourselves sometimes when we can't quite perceive our lives from an objective standpoint or a greater kind of that you found in your awakening. And so I want to just relate to you that I've been having these cries of acceptance lately where, that beautiful, the tears feel really good because you can perceive how beautiful everything was meant to be in your life, exactly the way it is. Yeah. And everything's falling into your life. Maybe people have come in and out of your life and you couldn't accept that before, but now you realize it's okay to pass through your life and pass through relationships and pass through experiences, and it didn't quite happen perfectly and it didn't happen exactly the way I wanted it, and if it did, I'd probably be really unhappy. Yes. But the way that you used mercy is the strangest thing, and I did not expect this, but this very deep river of emotion flowing through me those days. I remember feeling like some force had some kind of mercy, what did I do to deserve? Because I am a brat. I think at least my ego is, or however you want to say it, the thinking mind, the motor mind, the monkey mind, whatever you want to call it, that kind of, you can lose control of your negative thinking. And I would say that is in me as a brat. And so a sudden surrender of all of that to this, wow, just even though I've been like that, you're giving me this grace and mercy and this wonderful opportunity to perceive the beauty of my life again in kind of a new way, and also thank you for what is unfolding, because it can be, sometimes you find yourself in a season of your life where things are unfolding in this way that it's either internally you can accept it better, or things objectively are going really well. It's maybe it's a mix of both. But there is this attitude shift that can happen when you're having these deep emotions and these feelings of being given mercy despite, yes, I'm accountable for the dark side in me, kind of a mean streak or parts of my personality that are not perfect.
Absolutely. Yes, absolutely. Can you see some of those dark times in your life now being used for the good of you and others? Like, are you able to see a connection between some of those maybe times that were shameful or really difficult or really dark, but how they're being used now in a way that's unexpected and benefits you and others?
Yeah, the suffering and the harm I've caused other people in that suffering and that pain. Like my pain would lash out at other people and I would be almost always in a blackout but I remember going through that. And in some ways you have to be that to have a life story. That's like all the colors of being human. And you have to have had that experience in order to understand that experience. And once you've done your healing and once you've been through maybe many years of coming to acceptance and coming to forgiveness of every other person and for where they were at in their life when you had a relationship with them, or forgiveness of yourself, which I think is the most profound thing. Because I think when you can get to that place of real, total, radical acceptance and forgiveness of yourself, the flawed, the warts and all and everything, that can create this power to, to be helpful to other people that are going through it, and it feels really great to be able to be there for people.
Yeah.
It's a fulfilling career, and it's also fulfilling to just have friendships now that I'm in this better place.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Navigate people. I mean, people are in a lot of pain out there, and the whole world is suffering and grasping, and it's sort of the nature of being a person in capitalism too. It's sort of this, if I buy that house, if I get this car, if I get that piece into my life's going to be better.
Right.
And so living in that framework, I think leads to this mass consumer tendency for addictive traps to kind of be. I kind of think the shopping cart aisle is an addictive trap because processed foods make me really hungry and make me want more of them,
Yes.
Any kind of processed food. So it's just sort of, that's one little example of where consumerism and things are causing us suffering.
Absolutely. Yeah, and even that consumerism mentality goes beyond just material things. It can go into relationships. It can bleed into all areas of our lives, right? The ultimate result of that is destruction. It's like, again, as we talk about striving for perfection, that we'll never accomplish that. It's that same thing of, well, let's try this relationship. Let's try this, food. Let's try this, try to fill that hole, this new outfit, this new fad, this new skin beauty cream, whatever it is.
Health supplements.
And it's grasping at water. It's nothing that lasts.
Oh.
It's just emptiness.
Yeah. Interesting. Yeah. So tell me about how you're trying to help other people. What's going on in your professional life now?
Yeah, Rise Up Recovery. So, yeah, having a new lease on life and going through a lot of healing, working as a counselor again. I was actually working in a treatment center and finding myself having new eyes to see kind of this revolving door, right? And I was one that went through it, dozens of treatments, this revolving door, and it was this, what are we missing? Like, we're missing something. And it was a reflection back on not only my experiences, but the people that I was working with. And people would do really well when they were in a treatment setting, oftentimes, myself included. It was like, yes, I'm learning all this, I'm growing, I'm away from substances, so I've got some clarity of mind and putting on some weight, and right, all is well. And then all of a sudden you get back into the real world, and it was like, shoot, how do I actually apply this? And I'm not saying that people in early recovery are not capable individuals, but the reality is that we're in post-acute withdrawal. Our mental capacity to be able to make some of these connections of this information that I learned in treatment, which I wholeheartedly want to live into, and my ability to live into that and to access these resources, there's oftentimes a disconnect. And so it was this clear, we've got to work with people in that space of how do I live out recovery on a day-to-day basis? And that's really what birthed Rise Up Recovery was. Well, let's start a recovery community organization led by peers, people who have lived experience, who can really walk alongside people in a practical, pragmatic way and help them navigate early recovery or navigate getting into recovery. Those kind of bookends or our sweet spot. And it has been a tremendous blessing to be able to do that exact thing. I mean, I remember so many times where I was in the throes of my darkness and alone. And the one thing that I desperately needed was some kind of connection with somebody who got it. And I just felt like I didn't have that. And we get to be that for people. We get to be that person who, hey, I get it, I've been there, and you're really struggling, and my connection with you is not dependent on whether you're doing well or you're struggling. If you're struggling, I'll come and sit with you. Obviously, it has to be safe, but I will come and sit with you, and if you want to engage in treatment or you want to get support, I'll help you. Let's do that. And if today's not that day, okay, call me tomorrow. So it's a different way of kind of looking at recovery and the process of recovery, and hopefully fills those gaps that clinical staff can't ethically and just within their role fill. So that's what we do. We've got a lot of different programs. We do that. It looks different for each person, but the beauty of it is we get to meet people where they're at genuinely and walk alongside them as they journey this oftentimes challenging, scary road to recovery.
How's that contributed to the Hastings community?
Well, I'm proud of us. I think we contribute quite a bit. I think when we first came here, there was a lot of questions of like, who are you guys? And what do you want to do here? Do we even need that? I remember getting some pushback. Well, we have Cochrane and we have this and we have that. And it's like, yeah, we do, and that's great. But what we offer is different. And
the Cochrane left just now.
I know.
Yeah.
Yes. So I think that we are a huge blessing to this community. My hope and prayer continues to be that just continues to grow. And, the big message that we want people to know is shame thrives in darkness, and addiction thrives in secrecy and isolation. And we offer the opposite of that. We offer a place and people that you can be open and honest and transparent and bring all that darkness to light. And it doesn't scare us because we've been there. And that's where real healing can begin, And so there's not pressure when people come to our center if they're not quite ready to engage in treatment. That's okay. We're not going to force you or tell you have to. We're going to encourage you and be truth tellers, but we're going to meet you where you're at and support you. So yeah, we've got a big initiative, along with Alina and United Way to really combat this opiate crisis that we're facing right now. We work with a lot of people who are actively engaged with opiate use, and so we give out a lot of naloxone. We do a lot of naloxone trainings. We work with a lot of family members to help them get support for their piece of recovery, because this is a family illness, not just an individual illness. And so we continue to expand our work, expand our services, and try to just do better work. Most recently, we're going to be engaging in pretty significant training for our staff to be trauma responsive and trauma informed. We'll be updating all our policies and procedures and all that kind of stuff, because so much of the root of this for many people is related to trauma. And so we just want to be equipped to support and love people well.
Sounds like you believe in the trauma model. And what would you tell someone in the Hastings area that's really struggling? How would they get access to you as a resource? Rise Up Recovery, I mean.
Yeah, great question. I would first and foremost tell them you're not alone. You don't have to be alone. And to reach out for help. I think it's one of the most brave and courageous things that anybody can do is to extend that hand and say, I'm struggling, help me. And they can do that by either just stopping in. We're open during business hours, Monday through Friday, or they can give us a call, 651-319-0122, or they can visit our website, which is www.riseuprecoverymn.com.
And you're right on Vermilion Street?
Yes. Yep. Right across from KDWA and the fire station.
That's great. I love the community center, and I know I've sent people there, and it's very helpful to have like a pre-treatment, post-treatment housing type resource. It's really good to have those kind of resources in Hastings, because now that we're opening outpatient programs, people need a place to stay sometimes that's recovery supportive. Like sometimes people can't live on their own for a while.
Absolutely. Yeah, I burnt up all my resources. I had to live in sober living for quite a while, and it was a blessing to be able to be in community with like-minded people. The other piece, I don't know if everybody knows this yet, but we just opened up a women and children's housing program here in Hastings. It's small. It's 4 beds, so 2 women, each with 1 child. But we currently do have openings for that. So even moms that are trying to be reunited with their kiddos, or, trying to do everything they can to not get separated from their kid, that could be a good option for them too.
How does Rise Up help people who might otherwise fall through the cracks?
We're really diligent about aiming for those exact people. I think it's a really big system, and we've got a whole continuing care system, and there's a lot of really good treatment centers out there, including Alina. But the reality is that people's needs go so far beyond just treatment, right? And so our goal is to really help those people with some of those basic needs. And where traditional services can't step in and cover and support, we're able to do a lot of that stuff. Sometimes that might be transportation. Sometimes that might be just helping people navigate, making sure that they're taking their medications as prescribed. Sometimes that might look like getting to doctor's appointments, making sure they're taking care of their physical health. Maybe they want to try different support group meetings but are afraid to go by themselves. We can go with them. Those sorts of practical things. That's what we try to do. And even from a programmatic perspective, things like there's not a lot of women in children's housing, so let's open that. It's small, it's a small start, but let's start there, and if it grows, it grows. Same thing with the pre-treatment and post-treatment. There's not much of that. Those are people who often fall through the cracks. People who, hey, I think I want treatment, I think I want change, I'm ready now. If I don't get a bed today, I'm not going in. So we're like, great, here's a bed, come in today. Those sorts of ways are tangible ways we're trying to fill the gaps.
I've heard about all different kinds of recovery meetings that go on at Rise Up Recovery. I'm just kind of curious if you could list a little sample of your kind of recovery meetings you welcome there.
Yeah, that's a great question. So we definitely, as a recovery community organization, honor all pathways to recovery. We believe that my recovery may look very different from somebody else's recovery, and that's not only okay, it's celebrated and welcomed. And so we try to have a vast variety of support groups that people can resonate with. So that might be, we've got smart recovery groups. Smart recovery is really, it's skill-based and tool-based. And then we've got all recovery meetings. So that doesn't matter what your addiction is or substance or even relationship issue is, you can come to an all recovery meeting and get support. We've got some faith-based meetings. We've got some sexual addiction support group meetings. That's on Wednesday nights. We've got, what else? Celebrate recovery meetings. We've got soon to come a trauma and recovery meeting.
Oh, I've never heard of that.
And then a relapse group. So people who are really working on skills to support recovery and sustain long-term recovery and avoid relapse, or if somebody experiences a relapse and they want to get back on track, that'll be a group for that too.
I wanted to ask you, who are your inspirations?
Ooh, that's a good question. I got to cheat and see some of these questions ahead of time, and that was the one that sort of stumped me.
Okay. That's so good.
I mean, there's a lot of people who inspire me, to be honest. Obviously, my faith, Christ is my biggest inspiration, God. But there are so many people. I would say my grandma, who's not with me anymore, she passed away a number of years ago. I was 18 years old when she passed away, and she was just this powerhouse of a woman. And when I say powerhouse, she loved so fiercely. And she, to this day, when I think about times where I felt the most loved in my life tangibly, it was by her. And so that's something that I think of often, because I want people to leave my presence feeling cared for and important and loved, just like she did for me. I have a boss way early on, probably my first boss in my career as a counselor, who, Deb Walmsley, was just amazing. And she inspires me as a leader, as the leader of Rise Up Recovery. I want to lead like she led. So many people. I could go on and on.